What if everything you thought you knew about privacy was a lie? What if someone claiming to protect their personal life was secretly orchestrating the complete opposite? It sounds impossible, right? Yet, the story we are about to dive into revolves around exactly that question, a tangled web of perception, secrecy, and deletion. Imagine logging into your favorite social media platform, scrolling through photos, stories, posts you swore were permanent, only to realize they are gone. Every carefully curated memory, every public moment, vanished without a trace. What would you think? Mistake? Technical glitch? Or something far more deliberate? In the case of one of the world's most scrutinized figures, those disappearances were anything but accidental. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The name Arthur Edwards might not be immediately familiar to everyone, but in the world of royalty, photography, and decades of careful documentation, it carries weight. For over 50 years, Edwards has been one of the most respected royal photographers, chronicling generations with a precision and subtlety few can match. He has captured moments meant to be preserved, fleeting glances and smiles that become part of history. And yet, even someone of his reputation has recently become a key player in an unexpected controversy. Because, sometimes, it isn't what is captured on camera that causes the uproar. It's what disappears, what is deleted, what someone claims never existed. So why now? Why this story, this moment, this headline? In an era obsessed with digital permanence, deletion itself becomes suspicious. Social media is a time capsule. It archives moments for the world to see. And yet, there are gaps. Holes in the timeline that force us to question, what happened here? Why did she delete them? Why erase images tied to certain people, certain events? When everything disappears, every skeptic begins to wonder, is it a defensive move, a panic reaction, or something much more calculated? To understand the significance, we must first consider the concept of privacy in the modern age. Privacy has become both a weapon and a shield. It can protect, it can deceive. Public figures often claim privacy to control the narrative, to shield themselves from scrutiny. But claiming privacy while simultaneously curating which moments remain visible creates a contradiction, one that is difficult to ignore when glaring inconsistencies appear. When entire swaths of content are removed, when public records of interactions vanish, it sets off alarm bells for anyone paying attention. And in this case, it seems nothing was deleted at random. Every removal, every erased photo, every scrubbed timeline raises questions about intent, about motive, about the story beneath the story. Now let's talk about timing. This controversy is not happening in isolation. Public interest in the royal family, in celebrity culture, and in the mechanics of media manipulation is at an all-time high. People are tired of narratives that seem carefully packaged and designed for shock value. Yet they cannot resist the allure of hidden truths, secrets, and digital mysteries. When a prominent royal figure reportedly deletes content connected to a name as charged as Prince Andrew, speculation explodes. And while the allegations are delicate and unproven, the very act of removal speaks volumes. It signals a consciousness of public perception, an acute awareness of scrutiny, and possibly an attempt to control history before history controls you. Arthur Edwards' role in this drama is fascinating because it's unexpected. He is not a gossip columnist, nor is he a tabloid reporter seeking sensationalism. He is someone whose work has traditionally involved careful observation, discretion, and the silent collection of evidence over decades. When someone like Edwards speaks, or when his long-silenced opinions emerge, it carries significance. It is not simply the voice of the media, it is the voice of history itself. And his alleged remarks regarding privacy claims, the disappearance of certain photos, and the apparent contradictions between public statements and digital behavior have set off a chain reaction, one that the public and the media cannot ignore. Suddenly, the question of privacy is no longer theoretical. It is tangible, visible, and controversial. Imagine the tension that builds when the world notices that images which once existed, images that documented public moments alongside private interactions, suddenly vanish. Every deleted photo becomes a subject of discussion. Every erased post becomes a puzzle piece that refuses to fit anywhere. And in the age of the internet, where screenshots, archives, and second-hand accounts preserve what was thought to be lost, deletion is no longer a method of concealment. It is, paradoxically, a beacon that draws more attention than the original material ever could. People begin to ask, why remove these images now? What is being hidden? And, perhaps most importantly, what does it say about credibility and trust? To truly understand the depth of this story, we need to explore the paradox inherent in public figures claiming privacy while simultaneously curating visibility. The stakes are high. The audience is paying attention. Each deletion or mistake is magnified. And for someone like Meghan Markle, whose every action is dissected in real time, the pressure to manage perception is immense. Yet the very act of trying to control what the public sees can create cracks that no amount of careful planning can hide. When gaps appear where content once existed, when historical posts disappear, when names linked to sensitive controversies are removed, the public begins to speculate, whether justified or not. And that speculation becomes part of the narrative itself, feeding the drama, fueling curiosity, and keeping audiences engaged. So what actually happened? According to sources, multiple posts, images, and references were allegedly deleted in response to what some insiders describe as a privacy meltdown. Photos from yacht outings, moments tied to contentious associations, content that once existed publicly but now appears wiped clean, have been the subject of intense scrutiny. And while the veracity of all claims remains debated, the reaction itself, the deletions, the attempts to manage history, the sudden silence, has captured the public imagination. People are asking, was this panic? Was it deliberate? Or was it a strategic move to erase inconvenient narratives before they could cause lasting damage? But perhaps the most fascinating element of this unfolding drama is the interplay between public perception and reality. Privacy is often understood as secrecy. But in a digital world, secrecy is relative. Every deletion, every absence, every manipulated timeline is immediately noticeable. In attempting to control what others see, the individual inadvertently signals that something worth seeing existed in the first place. And that signal creates curiosity, doubt, and suspicion. The more one tries to erase, the more attention is drawn. And this is exactly the paradox at play in the current controversy. A paradox that Arthur Edwards, with his decades of careful observation, has publicly hinted at, sparking reactions that may never be fully contained. As we navigate this story, it is essential to ask, how does this affect our understanding of privacy, credibility, and public narrative? When a public figure deletes history, what message does it send? When an established royal photographer questions claims of privacy, what does that imply about the authenticity of those claims? And finally, when the public witnesses the digital erasure of potentially sensitive content, how does that shape trust and perception? These questions are not merely theoretical. They have real implications for how we view public figures, media reporting, and the manipulation of digital history in an age obsessed with visibility. Now, imagine the tension in the room when these deletions were first noticed. The public scrolls, notices the gaps, whispers start to spread, and media outlets begin to speculate. And amid all this, Arthur Edwards' remarks serve as a catalyst, highlighting a fundamental contradiction between the claims of privacy and the digital reality that contradicts them. Suddenly, what was once private becomes public in a new, dramatic way, not through leaks or breaches, but through absence. The void becomes the story itself, and everyone wants to know what once filled it. By now, you are likely asking yourself, what exactly was deleted? Why were these images, tied to highly sensitive names and potentially controversial situations, removed? And what does it reveal about the intersection of personal choice, public expectation, and historical record? These are questions that will be explored in detail in the chapters that follow. Each deleted image, each vanished post, each contradiction between words and actions adds another layer to a complex story of control, perception, and unintended consequences. And with every layer uncovered, the stakes become higher, the narrative more gripping, and the curiosity more insatiable. And yet, even as we begin this journey, one question looms larger than all the rest. Why now? Why this moment? Why this sudden scrutiny and simultaneous deletion? What prompted the alleged erasure of content that had existed publicly for years? It is here, in the timing, in the reaction, and in the contradiction between claim and reality, that the true drama begins to take shape. The world watches, debates, and speculates, while the subject of the story manages her own narrative through absence, through silence, and through selective visibility. But the story does not end with deletion alone. Because in a world where digital footprints are nearly indelible, where screenshots, archives, and recordings preserve even that which is removed, erasure becomes a paradoxical amplifier. The more one attempts to erase, the more attention is drawn. The more one claims privacy, the more curious the public becomes. And in this drama, fueled by timing, history, and public fascination, every action, deletion, statement, or silent omission becomes a clue in a puzzle the world is desperate to solve. And now, we arrive at the critical transition point. Arthur Edwards, a man whose career has been defined by discretion, reportedly broke his silence on the issue. His observations, delivered with decades of credibility, contrast sharply with the sudden vanishing of public content. It is this collision between deletion and documented history, between claim and contradiction, that sets the stage for the unfolding chapters. Because what comes next is not simply about vanished images or privacy claims. It is about the dramatic revelation that those very deletions may have spoken louder than any words ever could. If you think a camera is just a tool, think again. Some cameras don't just capture images, they capture history. And some photographers don't just take pictures, they record power, privilege, and secrets that the world rarely sees. Arthur Edwards is one of those photographers. For more than 50 years, he has chronicled the British royal family with a precision and patience few could match. Every smile, every glance, every candid moment that made it into the public eye bore his touch. But why does his name suddenly matter in the middle of a storm involving privacy claims, deleted posts, and allegations of vanished yacht photos? Because when someone like Edwards speaks, even indirectly, the world listens, and the stakes are enormous. To understand his significance, we need to go back to the early days of his career. Arthur Edwards didn't stumble into royal photography by accident. He climbed the ranks through meticulous observation, instinct, and an uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time, without disturbing the moment. The royal family has long been surrounded by photographers, both loyal and intrusive, but Edwards earned a reputation for discretion. He understood a delicate truth. Sometimes, the story isn't in the photograph itself, but in what the photograph allows others to infer. A fleeting glance between two royals, a hesitant handshake, a shadow crossing a familiar hallway. These were his specialties. They tell a story that words cannot capture. Fast forward to today. The same man, whose lens has recorded decades of history, suddenly becomes a focal point of controversy not because he took a picture, but because he observed a deletion. For decades, Edwards captured moments that became part of the historical record. He documented milestones, celebrations, conflicts, and reconciliations. His images were published in newspapers, magazines, and online platforms. They carried the weight of credibility because Edwards never sensationalized his work. He was a historian with a camera, silently documenting what unfolded in front of him. That credibility is now the very reason his comments, his subtle, allegedly off-the-record remarks, carry such power. Consider for a moment the skill it takes to photograph someone like a royal. You must be invisible, yet omnipresent. You must anticipate movement, emotion, and potential media spin. You must balance public curiosity with private discretion. Edwards mastered all of this, gaining the trust of his subjects while still delivering images that satisfy the insatiable public appetite for royal access. And that trust, the quiet understanding between subject and photographer, is precisely why his alleged reaction to disappearing images, deleted posts, and sudden claims of privacy is so impactful. It signals more than a professional observation. It implies a breach of a tacit contract between public figures and the chroniclers who document them. Why does this matter in the context of Meghan Markle and the recent controversy? Because Edwards, with his decades of experience, has witnessed countless cycles of public scrutiny, manipulation, and digital erasure. He has seen the public consume curated narratives, and he has seen the ways in which silence, deletion, or selective exposure can dramatically alter perception. When he allegedly commented on the disappearance of photos tied to highly sensitive names, it wasn't a casual remark. It was an insight from someone who knows the historical weight of images, the narrative power they hold, and the consequences of their absence. Let's talk about trust for a moment. A photographer like Edwards operates in a space defined by discretion. His credibility is his currency. To remain relevant over decades, he must carefully choose what to capture and how to present it. His images are not just photographs, they are records of public memory. And when he speaks, even indirectly, about alleged deletions or inconsistencies in what a public figure claims versus what can be observed, he introduces a new dimension to the story. Suddenly, deletion isn't just absence. It is commentary, whether intended or not. Now, imagine being a public figure under this scrutiny. Every movement is documented. Every post, image, and statement is analyzed for contradiction, intent, and narrative. When content is deleted, particularly images tied to sensitive or controversial subjects, it doesn't disappear quietly. It leaves a gap, and that gap is noticed. And who notices it first? Often, someone like Edwards, whose trained eye picks up patterns, absences, and inconsistencies that escape the casual observer. In this scenario, the disappearance of certain images isn't just a small hiccup in public records. It is a glaring anomaly to someone who has spent a lifetime cataloging what should be there. Consider the psychological weight of that moment. Edwards reportedly notices that images, once captured and publicized, are suddenly gone. Photos tied to yacht outings, social gatherings, and alleged associations no longer exist in public archives. A trained observer immediately sees a contradiction. Someone publicly claiming privacy has simultaneously controlled visibility with extreme precision, selectively deleting content that could fuel public speculation. Edwards' response, subtle but pointed, is more than a critique. It is an acknowledgement that history itself is being rewritten in real time. And in a world where public memory relies heavily on documented images, that act carries significance. There's also the symbolic weight of Edwards' alleged commentary. For a man who has spent decades photographing royals, commenting on privacy, deletion, and public perception is not trivial. He understands the balance between transparency and discretion. He understands how a single image can shift narrative, how a deleted post can incite curiosity, and how the absence of documentation can be more revealing than the images themselves. His experience lends credibility to any suggestion that selective erasure is not merely about privacy. It is about shaping perception, controlling narrative, and perhaps even influencing history itself. And this is where the tension escalates. The public is watching, questioning, and dissecting the story. Edwards' alleged remarks suggest that the deletions were not random. They hint at intentionality, strategy, and perhaps panic. And for audiences, that raises a difficult question. When someone carefully curates their public presence while claiming privacy, what does that really mean? Does deletion signal innocence, or does it suggest a desire to control perception at all costs? Edwards' perspective as a historian behind the lens gives weight to these questions in a way that casual speculation cannot. The emotional stakes cannot be overstated. Imagine following someone's public life for years, capturing their smiles, their private moments, their interactions, and suddenly noticing that the digital record has been altered. It's a jarring realization. The images you relied on to document history, to verify public statements, to understand behavior, are gone. For Edwards, this is more than professional observation. It is an emotional and ethical signal. He has witnessed history disappear before his eyes, and his response underscores the tension between public narrative and private management. So what does this mean for the unfolding story? It means that the lens of credibility has shifted. Where previously public commentary and speculation might have held sway, the perspective of someone like Edwards introduces historical authority. His alleged remarks illuminate the stakes, underscore contradictions, and amplify public curiosity. The deletions, which might have been intended to conceal or control, now become evidence of a narrative under scrutiny. Every absent photo, every erased post, every carefully curated deletion is now part of the story, a story observed, recorded, and analyzed by a professional whose life has been spent documenting such moments. And yet, despite the years of observation, despite the decades of careful photography, Edward's alleged commentary is only the beginning. The world now turns its attention to the vanished content itself. What images were deleted? What moments erased? What associations quietly excised from public record? The very act of noticing these deletions, combined with the credibility of the observer, creates a ripple effect. Suddenly, curiosity is heightened, speculation intensifies, and the stakes skyrocket. For the public, the drama is no longer hypothetical. It is visible, tangible, and unfolding in real time. As we move forward, one question lingers. Why does a single observer, no matter how credible, have the power to reignite a controversy that many assumed was long buried? The answer lies in authority, perception, and the unique position of someone like Edwards. He is not a casual onlooker. He is a historian, an archivist, and a witness to decades of public life. His voice carries weight because he has earned it. And when his perspective collides with sudden deletions, contradictions, and claims of privacy, it amplifies the narrative, forcing the public to confront inconsistencies they might have ignored otherwise. But here is the most crucial point. Edward's alleged observations don't merely comment on the past. They foreshadow the unfolding drama. By drawing attention to what has been erased, he frames the public understanding of what is happening now. The deleted content, the claims of privacy, the vanished images, all are now viewed through the lens of historical credibility. And that perspective will influence how every subsequent chapter of this story is interpreted, discussed, and dissected. So, as we prepare to delve into the next stage of this narrative, remember this: the man behind the lens matters. His experience, discretion, and historical insight provide a window into what is truly happening beneath the surface of public statements and digital erasure. And when someone of his stature hints at contradictions, the world listens. Privacy. It's a word that carries weight, authority, and, sometimes, contradiction. But what does privacy really mean when you claim it publicly while simultaneously curating every moment of your life for the world to see? It's a paradox that has defined the public narrative surrounding Meghan Markle for years, and it's a paradox that has become impossible to ignore in the wake of disappearing photos, deleted posts, and selective visibility. Imagine saying to the world, "I value my privacy," while every move, every smile, and every step is captured, broadcast, and scrutinized. How can one reconcile the demand for secrecy with an unmistakable appetite for attention? From the beginning, Meghan Markle's relationship with privacy has been complicated. She has openly discussed the pressures of public life, the intrusion of media, and the desire to protect her family from constant scrutiny. On paper, those statements sound reasonable, even admirable. Who wouldn't want to shield themselves and their loved ones from relentless attention? But actions speak louder than words. When you release documentaries, participate in high-profile interviews, and carefully craft social media personas, you're engaging in a constant negotiation between exposure and discretion. It's not inherently wrong, but it does create a tension that becomes more pronounced the more one observes it. The tension becomes especially vivid when we examine deleted content. Entire posts, images, and references, carefully preserved for years, suddenly vanish. Yacht outings that were once public are removed. Associations that existed in plain sight are erased. For the casual observer, this may seem like a simple act of digital housekeeping, a way to reclaim privacy. But for someone paying close attention, the deletions reveal a pattern, a selective shaping of history. It raises questions. Why delete certain content but leave other moments visible? Why erase evidence tied to certain names, events, or social settings while promoting other moments that fit a specific narrative? This is the paradox. Privacy is claimed, yet visibility is manipulated. The two are at odds, creating a contradiction that is impossible to ignore. Consider this analogy. Imagine a theater where the curtains are drawn at random moments. Sometimes you can see the actors clearly, sometimes shadows flicker, sometimes nothing is visible at all. You are left to interpret the story based on glimpses, fragments, and sudden disappearances. This is what the digital erasure of posts and images feels like to the public and to media observers. Every deletion is a drawn curtain, every absence a question mark, every visible post a deliberate scene in a play being curated in real time. And yet, despite the careful crafting, inconsistencies emerge. Moments that contradict public statements, images that challenge claims of privacy, patterns that suggest deliberate narrative control. The emotional component of this paradox cannot be overstated. Privacy is deeply personal. To publicly claim it is to assert boundaries. But when boundaries are selectively applied, the public begins to question authenticity. They notice discrepancies. They see contradictions between words and actions. And when these contradictions involve names tied to sensitive controversies, the stakes are amplified. Suddenly, privacy is no longer simply a desire or a boundary, it is a performance. It becomes a tool to manage perception rather than a shield for personal protection. This is where credibility comes into play. When someone claims privacy but engages in a careful curation of exposure, observers begin to weigh statements against behavior. Every deleted post, every vanished photo, and every selective release of content becomes a data point. It tells a story that may be at odds with public statements. It raises questions. Is the claim of privacy genuine, or is it a rhetorical device used to justify selective control? And when someone like Arthur Edwards, with decades of historical observation, notices these contradictions, his perspective adds weight. He sees not just the deletions but the patterns they create, the narrative they shape, and the implications they carry for public perception. Another layer of complexity emerges when we examine the timing of these deletions. Why remove content now, at this particular moment, when public interest is high? What triggers a person to erase carefully curated digital history after years of it being publicly accessible? The answers are speculative, but the impact is undeniable. Timing, in the digital age, is as important as content. A post deleted months ago may go unnoticed, but a post deleted amid heightened scrutiny signals awareness, intention, and control. It signals that someone is managing perception actively, not passively. And it signals that history itself is being rewritten in real time. Humor, irony, and contradiction intermingle in this paradox. Publicly claiming privacy while simultaneously promoting high-profile projects and releasing curated moments for public consumption creates a tension that borders on theatrical. The audience sees the gap between claim and action and can't help but react, sometimes with skepticism, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with disbelief. The paradox is inherently dramatic because it pits intention against perception, words against behavior, and the ideal of privacy against the reality of constant visibility. Now, let's consider the role of social media in this equation. Platforms designed to share and preserve content have become arenas of negotiation between public and private identity. When posts are deleted, when images are scrubbed, and when timelines are altered, the digital record becomes a living entity, constantly shifting under the influence of personal control. This creates both opportunity and risk. On one hand, it allows for management of public perception. On the other, it draws attention precisely because it is noticeable. Every deletion becomes a spark for speculation, every absence a magnet for curiosity, every altered narrative a new thread for public discussion. This is where contradictions become particularly salient. Public statements about valuing privacy are juxtaposed against moments of high visibility, documentaries, interviews, selective social media engagement. This contrast is stark. It forces observers to reconcile two competing narratives, one of privacy and one of strategic exposure. And when deletions of content related to controversial names occur, the contrast sharpens. The narrative becomes more than a story about privacy. It becomes a story about control, curation, and the tension between public expectation and personal behavior. The emotional resonance of this paradox is amplified by the audience's role in interpretation. Viewers, readers, and followers are not passive. They notice absences, question motives, and create narratives to fill gaps. The paradox invites engagement because it is inherently unresolved. The tension between claiming privacy and controlling visibility generates curiosity, debate, and speculation. It encourages audiences to ask questions. What is being hidden? What does deletion signify? And how much of the public narrative is genuine versus curated? Consider this direct question for reflection. If someone truly values privacy, would they simultaneously manage visibility so meticulously? Would they delete selected posts, remove images tied to sensitive associations, and carefully curate public presence while claiming discretion? The contradiction is stark, and it forces the public to assess credibility, intention, and behavior simultaneously. This is the paradox in its purest form, a tension between desire for privacy and the unavoidable consequences of selective exposure. And yet, even as we analyze this paradox, one cannot ignore the strategic elements at play. Deletion is rarely accidental. In the context of digital presence, every erased image, every removed post, every altered timeline can be interpreted as an intentional act. It signals awareness, calculation, and control. For a public figure under intense scrutiny, this control is both a shield and a weapon, but it is also a double-edged sword. Because in attempting to manage perception, one inevitably draws attention to absence, highlighting the very moments one may wish to obscure. This brings us back to the central tension of this chapter, saying one thing while doing another. The public claim of privacy versus the visible act of deletion creates a dynamic where narrative and behavior are at odds. It invites analysis, speculation, and judgment. It also raises questions about authenticity. When words and actions do not align, the gap becomes the story. And in the world of celebrity, royalty, and digital media, the story is never just about the individual. It is about perception, legacy, and historical record. Finally, as we prepare to move forward, consider this. Every act of deletion, every claim of privacy, every contradiction between word and action is a thread in a larger tapestry. The public observes, commentators analyze, and historians like Arthur Edwards notice patterns that casual observers may miss. The paradox is not simply a matter of behavior. It is a reflection of power, perception, and the inherent tension between control and authenticity. And as the next chapters unfold, we will explore how these contradictions manifest in specific actions, vanished images, and digital erasures that continue to captivate the public imagination. You open your social media account expecting to scroll through familiar posts, moments frozen in time, and snapshots of history that you assumed would be permanent. But today they're gone. Every image, every post, every trace of what once existed has vanished. You wonder if it's a technical glitch, a hacker, or a mass error. But no. In this case, the vanishing was deliberate. Welcome to the world of the Great Digital Vanishing Act, where content disappears not by accident, but by intent, and where absence becomes louder than presence. The phenomenon of deliberate deletion is not new, but the scale and timing of certain high-profile cases have made it a subject of fascination. In the context of Meghan Markle, what is being discussed is not a random loss of posts or images. It is the targeted removal of content that carries both personal and public significance. Yacht outings, associations with certain individuals, and posts linked to moments of historical or controversial relevance reportedly disappeared overnight. It's as if someone pressed a button and erased pieces of history that had once been indisputable. And when a trained observer like Arthur Edwards notices these gaps, the implications are amplified. This is not just about privacy. It is about the manipulation of public memory. Think about the psychology behind deletion. When content is permanently removed, it creates a void that is immediately noticeable, especially in an era where audiences are hyper-aware of timelines, posts, and digital footprints. Every deleted post sparks speculation. Why was this removed? What was the motivation? Who benefits from erasing this content? And in cases involving controversial figures or sensitive associations, the answers become even more critical. The act of deletion itself tells a story, one that can often be louder than the content that was removed. The Great Digital Vanishing Act is both subtle and shocking. On one level, it appears to be a simple measure to reclaim privacy or remove unwanted attention. On another, it sends a clear message. Control over narrative is paramount. Every erased image, every scrubbed post, every vanished interaction becomes a calculated act of influence. The audience senses it, and the media responds. Analysts, commentators, and casual observers begin to map what existed against what is missing. Patterns emerge. connections are inferred, and suddenly, absence becomes an instrument of storytelling. Consider this scenario: a photo that had been visible for years, perhaps showing a yacht outing, a public event, or a private gathering, is suddenly gone. Screenshots and secondary sources preserve fragments of what was once visible, but the original post, curated and presented by the subject themselves, is no longer accessible. The effect is striking. The public begins to speculate about the reasons behind the deletion. Was it a personal decision, a response to criticism, or an effort to erase potentially damaging associations? The ambiguity fuels curiosity, and curiosity fuels engagement. In digital culture, absence is not neutral. It is a powerful signal that demands attention. The emotional impact of this vanishing act is significant, both for the observer and for the public. For observers, especially those with historical or professional expertise like Arthur Edwards, deletion is a red flag. It signals intention, awareness, and the possibility of narrative control. For the public, the experience is disorienting. Moments they assumed were permanent, visible for reflection, debate, or memory, suddenly vanish. The sense of stability and continuity is disrupted, creating a tension that draws attention, encourages speculation, and magnifies the drama. Digital deletion also raises questions about authenticity. When posts and images are removed selectively, it becomes clear that visibility is being managed. Certain moments remain public, while others are excised. This selective visibility contradicts claims of privacy, because true privacy would not require curating what the public can and cannot see. Instead, selective deletion suggests a strategic management of perception, a way to control how a story is told, remembered, and interpreted. The Great Digital Vanishing Act is not merely a technical phenomenon. It is a deliberate exercise of influence. Now, let's examine the timing of these deletions. Timing is everything in the digital age. Removing content during a period of heightened scrutiny, when media outlets are analyzing behavior and the public is highly engaged, does not go unnoticed. Every deletion becomes a signal, a calculated move in a high-stakes game of narrative control. Audiences immediately notice gaps, and speculation begins. Why now? Why these posts and not others? What message is being sent? The answers are not always clear, but the act itself generates tension, intrigue, and attention. The paradox of deletion is further complicated by the permanence of digital memory. In theory, the internet never forgets. Screenshots, third-party archives, and fan recordings preserve content even after it has been removed. So while deletion attempts to create privacy, it also inadvertently draws attention. The very act of erasure signals that something noteworthy once existed, prompting the public and media to investigate. In effect, the vanishing act magnifies curiosity rather than suppressing it. This is the irony at the heart of the Great Digital Vanishing Act. The more one tries to erase, the more conspicuous the absence becomes. Let's talk about emotional stakes. For the individual managing these deletions, the motivation may range from protecting personal privacy to controlling public perception or avoiding controversy. For observers, especially those attuned to public narratives and history, the act of deletion evokes a mix of suspicion, frustration, and intrigue. It challenges assumptions about transparency, credibility, and honesty. Every erased post raises questions about intent, consistency, and authenticity. And in cases involving prominent figures, the emotional and reputational stakes are enormous. Consider, for example, posts tied to sensitive or controversial associations. When such content is deleted, the public immediately notices the discrepancy between claim and behavior. If an individual publicly asserts privacy, yet selectively removes content, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Audiences begin to question motives, examine patterns, and reconstruct the narrative using both what remains and what has been erased. Deletion, in this context, becomes an active element of storytelling, one that influences perception, shapes interpretation, and drives engagement. The mechanics of digital deletion are also worth noting. It's not just about removing posts. It's about carefully managing visibility, erasing traces, and attempting to control narrative flow. Social media platforms, photo archives, and public repositories each present unique challenges and opportunities. To successfully execute a vanishing act, one must be deliberate, precise, and strategic. Random deletion is noticeable. Coordinated removal suggests intention. And when gaps appear in previously public timelines, the result is a narrative puzzle that invites scrutiny, analysis, and interpretation. But perhaps the most fascinating element of the Great Digital Vanishing Act is its psychological impact on the audience. Human nature is drawn to absence, gaps, and mystery. When content disappears, curiosity is ignited. Observers speculate about what existed, why it was removed, and what it implies about the individual involved. The void left by deletion becomes a canvas on which the public projects narrative, context, and meaning. In many ways, the absence of content can be more compelling than its presence. It creates suspense, uncertainty, and drama, all of which are essential ingredients in sustaining audience engagement. This is where Arthur Edwards' perspective becomes crucial. His alleged observations about the disappearing content do not merely highlight the deletions. They underscore the significance of patterns and historical consistency. Edwards has spent decades documenting the lives of public figures, understanding both the visible and the invisible elements of behavior. His expertise allows him to notice gaps, contradictions, and strategic erasures that might escape casual observers. By calling attention to these patterns, he elevates the significance of what has vanished, transforming deletion from a passive act into an active narrative element. Moreover, the Vanishing Act demonstrates the tension between public and private interests. On one hand, individuals have a right to manage their digital presence, to protect privacy, and to curate personal content. On the other hand, public figures operate in a space where visibility, scrutiny, and documentation are unavoidable. The collision between these interests generates drama, curiosity, and conflict. Deletion, in this context, becomes both a defensive mechanism and a narrative weapon, shaping perception even as it attempts to obscure it. The implications extend beyond the individual. Every deleted post, image, or timeline entry becomes part of a broader discourse about authenticity, credibility, and historical record. Audiences, media analysts, and historians alike are forced to reconcile absence with existing documentation, to interpret intention through omission, and to assess credibility based on selective visibility. The Great Digital Vanishing Act is not merely about a single individual. It is a reflection of how public narratives are constructed, contested, and controlled in the digital era. And here's the most compelling part. The deletions are not isolated incidents. They form a pattern. Patterns are inherently meaningful because they suggest intention. Random erasure is forgettable. Deliberate vanishing is conspicuous. The public notices patterns. Observers reconstruct timelines, compare posts, and evaluate contradictions. In doing so, they uncover insights that may never have been revealed through visible content alone. Absence, in this sense, becomes more revealing than presence. Finally, the Great Digital Vanishing Act serves as a prelude to the controversies that follow. It sets the stage for speculation, investigation, and debate. By removing content tied to sensitive associations, carefully managing timelines, and selectively curating visibility, the subject signals awareness, intention, and strategic calculation. But as we have seen, absence is never silent. It speaks volumes, draws attention, and ignites curiosity. The stage is set for the next chapter of the story, one in which controversial associations, public scrutiny, and vanished content collide in ways that will challenge assumptions and captivate audiences. It started with whispers, quiet, almost imperceptible at first, circulating in corners of the internet that thrive on secrecy and speculation. Rumors that seemed too improbable to take seriously gained traction because, in the age of social media and instant communication, whispers rarely stay whispers for long. Yacht parties, shadowed corners of public events, fleeting interactions. Suddenly, these fragments were being pieced together into a narrative that demanded attention. And at the center of it all were Meghan Markle and an association that would send shockwaves through the media, Prince Andrew. Imagine a scene. A sun-drenched deck on a luxury yacht. The waves glittering in the afternoon sun. a gathering of people whose social standing and influence are hard to overstate. Laughter and clinking glasses, conversations carried on the breeze. It sounds like a momentary snapshot of leisure, a private gathering meant to be ephemeral. But in this case, the alleged event would become the cornerstone of a swirling storm of speculation, deletion, and contradiction. Observers, both casual and professional, began to notice. Photos existed at one point, documenting presence, proximity, and interactions. And then they were gone. The vanishing of these images transformed an ordinary gathering into a digital ghost story, a mystery that begged for explanation. The origins of the yacht rumors are complex, woven from a mixture of public observation, leaked accounts, and subtle reporting. Some of it emerged from insiders familiar with the circles involved, others from photographs and social media posts that hinted at gatherings beyond the public eye. The content that survived often offered glimpses of formal events, but whispers suggested additional private moments, informal encounters that, if true, carried far more significance than what was publicly documented. These whispers, combined with the sudden disappearance of posts and images, created a fertile ground for speculation. At the heart of the matter is the paradox we have discussed before: visibility versus privacy. Yacht gatherings, by nature, are private. They occur in locations meant to limit public access, but they are not immune to observation. Professional photographers, journalists, and even casual observers can capture fleeting moments that become part of the historical record. And when images disappear, the question inevitably arises: why were these moments deleted? Was it a routine act of personal discretion, a response to unwanted attention, or something more deliberate? The timing and selectivity of the vanishing act lend themselves to all three possibilities, but they also amplify curiosity, tension, and controversy. This is where narrative control enters the picture. In public life, especially for someone as scrutinized as Meghan Markle, every moment, every interaction, every image is potentially meaningful. Yacht outings may seem mundane, a setting for leisure, conversation, and relaxation, yet the associations they imply carry weight. When digital evidence vanishes, the absence becomes a signal that something requires careful interpretation. Analysts, commentators, and the public alike attempt to reconstruct events, infer motives, and evaluate the implications of both presence and absence. The deleted content becomes a canvas for speculation, allowing observers to fill in gaps with assumptions, narratives, and theories. It's also essential to consider the timing of attention. The yacht rumors did not emerge in a vacuum. They were amplified by a convergence of factors: the deletion of images, ongoing public fascination with the royal family, and the media's instinct to dissect every action for meaning. In the digital age, timing is critical. A post deleted quietly months ago may escape notice, but deletions that coincide with heightened scrutiny serve as lightning rods for public attention. They create immediate curiosity, generate discussion, and force observers to question motives. Every erased moment becomes a clue, a fragment, a signpost pointing to questions that demand answers. The emotional weight of these allegations is significant. Yacht gatherings are, at their surface, innocent and social. But when tied to names with historical controversy, they take on a charged significance. The mere suggestion of proximity, interaction, or association with a controversial figure generates scrutiny, suspicion, and often judgment. And when visual evidence of these events disappears, the emotional impact is intensified. The public fills in the blanks with assumptions, narratives, and speculation. The absence becomes louder than presence, and curiosity escalates into debate. At the same time, we must recognize the challenges of digital verification. Screenshots, secondary sources, and archived accounts preserve fragments of what once existed, but they rarely provide full context. The public may see an image without understanding the circumstances, the intention, or the full scope of the gathering. Rumors, therefore, thrive in this environment. They bridge gaps in knowledge, create narratives from incomplete data, and often escalate quickly. A single missing photo can spawn hundreds of theories. A deleted post can ignite discussion, argument, and speculation. The yacht, in this case, becomes both literal and symbolic. A vessel of mystery, rumor, and digital disappearance. Adding to the intrigue is the paradoxical nature of attention itself. Public figures often seek to manage perception by controlling what is visible, yet every deletion, every selective post, every carefully curated moment draws attention to absence. In the case of the yacht images, the vanishing act created a spotlight on what was hidden. The missing content, combined with whispers and speculation, amplified curiosity far beyond what the original images might have achieved if they had remained public. In this sense, the act of erasure transformed a private moment into a subject of intense public scrutiny. Direct audience engagement is crucial here. Think about this. If you were following a public figure's digital presence, and suddenly posts that had existed for years disappeared overnight, how would you interpret it? Would you assume a technical glitch? Would you think someone was being careful with their privacy? Or would you suspect that the deletion was intentional, meant to obscure connections, interactions, or associations that might be damaging, controversial, or misinterpreted? This is the very question the public faces in response to the disappearing yacht images. The timing, context, and selectivity of the deletions all point to a calculated decision. Yacht images tied to high-profile or controversial figures vanish, while other content remains untouched. Patterns emerge. Observers begin to map timelines, associations, and sequences, noting what exists and what doesn't. The paradox of claiming privacy while selectively deleting content becomes increasingly visible, intensifying speculation. Every absence, every erased image, every vanished timeline entry becomes part of a larger puzzle. And the irony cannot be overstated. In attempting to maintain privacy, digital deletions have made the yacht gatherings more notorious than they might have been if left untouched. The very act of erasure signals awareness, strategic thought, and deliberate control, drawing attention to the gaps. Absence becomes narrative, silence becomes a story, and the public, observers, and commentators are left to reconstruct events from fragments, whispers, and speculation. The yacht allegations, therefore, are not just about presence or absence. They are about perception, control, and digital legacy. They illustrate how strategic deletions, selective visibility, and public statements can interact to create controversy, curiosity, and drama. And they highlight the tension between what is claimed and what is observed, the very heart of the privacy paradox. As the story unfolds, these vanished yacht images serve as a central point of reference. They are the spark that ignites scrutiny, the missing pieces that generate questions, and the evidence, or lack thereof, that fuels public fascination. Observers cannot ignore them, because their absence is more compelling than any image that remains visible. Every missing post, every deleted photo, every erased association creates a void that demands attention. But the vanishing act is just the beginning. The next revelation, a perspective from someone who has spent decades observing, documenting, and understanding the dynamics of public figures and the royal family, will shift the conversation from speculation to something far more compelling. Few names carry as much instant recognition, controversy, and gravity as that of Prince Andrew. A royal whose life has been dissected by the media for decades, whose associations have sparked debate and scrutiny, and whose very presence in public narratives can ignite waves of curiosity and speculation. And in the context of the disappearing yacht images, the mention of his name changes everything. Suddenly, what might have been dismissed as mere leisure or private social interaction is transformed into a high-stakes story with historical, social, and media ramifications. To understand why Prince Andrew's association magnifies this narrative, we must consider the backdrop of his history. Over the years, Andrew has been entangled in public controversies that extend beyond mere gossip. Allegations of misconduct, legal challenges, and intensely scrutinized social connections have made him a lightning rod for media attention. For someone like Meghan Markle, whose every public action is scrutinized, an association with Andrew, however fleeting or innocuous, carries immense risk. It is a connection that invites questions, speculation, and judgment, regardless of context or intent. Now imagine a yacht gathering, a private setting, where images were once publicly available. People would see proximity, smiles, and shared moments. In isolation, such images might appear harmless. But in the context of Andrew's controversial profile, they become charged with meaning. Every deleted image, every scrubbed post, every erased interaction is now viewed through a lens of suspicion. Observers, aware of the stakes, immediately ask, why remove these images? What does deletion imply? And most importantly, what associations are being hidden, curated, or managed? The impact of association cannot be underestimated. In media narratives, proximity is interpreted as endorsement, engagement, or familiarity. In social networks, connections suggest alignment, participation, or shared experience. And when those connections involve controversial figures, even casual or benign interactions can be amplified into major talking points. Prince Andrew's name, by itself, triggers historical awareness, curiosity, and intense scrutiny. Combine that with the vanishing digital content, and the story becomes irresistible to both the media and the public. Let's break down the psychology at play. For the individual managing public perception, deleting content connected to a controversial figure is a strategic act. It limits exposure, minimizes potential criticism, and attempts to control narrative. But for observers, the deletion itself becomes a signal. It raises questions. Why remove images linked to Andrew specifically? Why now, after years of public visibility? What is being avoided? The absence becomes louder than presence. The act of erasure, rather than obscuring the association, actually draws attention to it. Arthur Edwards' perspective is particularly illuminating in this scenario. Decades of chronicling the royal family have given him a deep understanding of how public perception is shaped. He knows that every gesture, every image, every deleted post carries weight. His alleged observations regarding the vanished yet images and their connection to Prince Andrew highlight a fundamental contradiction. Claims of privacy clash with the deliberate removal of content. Edwards' insight suggests that these deletions are not random or trivial. They are strategic, intentional, and consequential. Timing amplifies the effect. The images were not just deleted, they were removed in a period of heightened scrutiny, at a time when public interest in Meghan Markle's actions and associations was at a peak. In the digital age, timing is everything. A deletion made years ago might escape notice, but a deletion made during intense media focus acts like a flare in the night sky. Everyone sees it, everyone reacts, and everyone begins to ask questions about intent, context, and implication. The emotional stakes are equally significant. Public figures are acutely aware of the reputational risks associated with controversial associations. An image suggesting proximity or familiarity with a figure like Prince Andrew could fuel negative speculation, undermine credibility, and provoke public criticism. Deleting such images can be seen as an effort to mitigate these risks, yet paradoxically, the act of deletion itself invites attention. Observers are naturally curious about what was removed, why it was removed, and what hidden context it might contain. This is where the paradox becomes most visible. On one hand, the deletion is a defensive move, a way to claim privacy and limit exposure. On the other, it is inherently provocative because it signals that there was something worth hiding. Absence becomes evidence. Silence becomes a statement. And the combination of controversy, timing, and selective deletion transforms ordinary social interaction into a narrative loaded with speculation, tension, and drama. Media response further escalates the stakes. Journalists, bloggers, and social commentators immediately seize upon any connection to Prince Andrew, particularly when digital evidence disappears. The narrative rapidly evolves from a simple question of privacy to a full-blown story of selective curation, narrative control, and historical implication. Deleted posts are archived, screenshots circulate, and analysts map interactions to construct timelines. Every vanishing image becomes a puzzle piece, every missing post a clue, every absence a spark for debate. Direct audience engagement is vital here. Think about it. If you were following a high-profile public figure and noticed that all content related to a controversial figure suddenly disappeared, how would you interpret it? Would you assume caution, calculation, or concealment? Would you trust the stated reasons, or would the contradictions between words and actions compel deeper investigation? These are the questions the public confronts, and they illustrate the tension between privacy, perception, and digital legacy. The strategic elements of deletion are also important to consider. It is not simply about removing content. It is about controlling narrative flow, managing associations, and shaping historical record. The images that remain, the posts that survive, and the timelines that are curated all contribute to perception. By selectively deleting content tied to Prince Andrew, the individual exercises influence over how history, media, and public opinion interpret the interactions. This is narrative control in its most subtle yet powerful form. The paradoxical outcome is striking. Attempting to minimize exposure to controversy by deleting content paradoxically amplifies the association in public consciousness. Observers notice gaps, reconstruct scenarios, and speculate about motives. In the digital age, deletion does not erase history. It magnifies curiosity. Every removed image, every scrubbed post, every vanished timeline entry becomes fodder for discussion, analysis, and interpretation. The very act of managing perception ensures that attention is drawn to the points one might wish to obscure. And yet, despite all the scrutiny, questions remain. How close were these interactions? What context is missing? Were the associations benign, casual, or more significant than initially perceived? The absence of visual evidence prevents easy answers, while simultaneously fueling speculation. It is a paradox in its purest form. Deletion is intended to protect, yet it simultaneously provokes attention, analysis, and curiosity. The digital void becomes a narrative itself, a story told by what is missing rather than what is visible. Finally, this chapter highlights a critical insight. The name Prince Andrew does more than evoke controversy. It transforms context, escalates stakes, and reframes perception. Associations with high-profile, historically scrutinized figures carry a weight that ordinary connections cannot match. When combined with deliberate deletion and selective visibility, these associations become the focal point of narrative, curiosity, and public scrutiny. They illustrate the paradox of privacy, the power of absence, and the complexity of narrative control in the digital age. The moment images disappear, chaos begins. Not in the physical sense, but in the digital ecosystem, where every absence creates ripples that spread faster than any post could. Social media thrives on visibility, but it thrives even more on absence. When Meghan Markle's yacht images reportedly vanished, the platforms that had once showcased them erupted with screenshots, archived reposts, commentary, and speculation. Within hours, what was meant to be a private deletion became a public spectacle. A perfect storm of curiosity, outrage, and analysis.